Southern Belgium in the 19th century was one of the most heavily industrialized parts of Western Europe. This painting by Constantin Meunier, a Belgian artist who specialized in depicting the landscapes and people of this region, shows the darkness, smoke, and grime that gave this area its name of the Black Country, Le Pays Noir. Meunier's picture shows a typical scene in the western part of the Pays Noir, in the province of Hainaut, a district called the Borinage because of the many mine shafts, or bores, that mark the landscape. If you have heard the name Borinage before in connection with art, it is probably through its association with the early career of Vincent van Gogh. He lived in this area in the late 1870s while working as a Protestant pastor in the mining villages, an experience which profoundly shaped his character and his art. Belgian industrialization primarily took place in the French-speaking south of the country, as distinct from the mainly agrarian and Flemish-speaking north, and the heartland of Belgian heavy industry was the Sambre-et-Meuse Valley. Underlying the rise of iron and steel-making and engineering in this region were mineral resources, above all coal, from the rich coalfields that stretch from the French border in the west through Mons, Charleroi, and Namur to Liège in the east. The Belgian coal mining industry had a long history even before the Industrial Revolution, and during the 19th century it expanded greatly. In 1896, more than 21 million tons of coal was produced in Belgium, and the country was third in the world, after Great Britain and Germany, in the amount of coal exported. By the mid-1890s, over 120,000 people worked in Belgium's coalfields, about 90,000 of them working underground. This workforce, both above and below ground, included thousands of women. Between the 1860s and the early 1890s, the proportion of female workers at Belgian coal mines is estimated to have varied between 10% and 16%. Their ages ranged from girls of 10 or 11 to women in their 70s. There was nothing unusual about women and girls working in coal mines, and in many mining areas, including those in Belgium, the mines were an important source of female employment. Increasing moral, ethical, and welfare concerns about women in the mines led in Great Britain to the banning of female mine workers from underground work, although not from work at the surface, in 1842. Gradually, other European countries followed suit, with most passing legislation to end underground work by women between the 1870s and the 1890s. In most countries, as in Britain, the controversy which led to this legislation was driven by middle-class beliefs about appropriate and respectable feminine behavior and the dangers of working-class sexual immorality, as much as it was by concerns over the welfare of the women and girls themselves. Much of this legislation was gradual in effect, phasing out female underground work rather than ending it abruptly, and was often tied to other measures, restricting child labour and working hours. In almost all cases, female employment continued above ground at mines. In Belgium, the issue of women and girls working in mines never caused the public controversy that it did in other countries, but Belgium followed its neighbours in restricting the practice, partly under the influence of the National Miners' Union, which wanted to prevent women competing for what it saw as men's jobs. As a result, the Belgian labour law of 1889 placed various restrictions on female underground work in mines, and provided for a complete ban to be brought into gradual effect from 1892. In Belgian mines, women did every kind of work except cutting coal and working with explosives. There was no question of softer tasks being reserved for female workers. They worked as hard as the men, for the same long hours, and for lower pay. They endured the same hardships and faced the same risks of injury and death in the often very dangerous conditions of the mines, and, as women, they had to deal with challenges that no man has ever faced, such as working while pregnant. The Belgian politician Lucie Desjardins, who was the first female member of the Chamber of Deputies, was a mine worker herself who first went underground in 1885 at 10 years old. She recalled that it was not unknown for women working in the mines to give birth underground, and that one of her own siblings had been born in the mine. On the surface, women were heavily involved in sorting and washing the coal and disposing of waste material by means of railways and aerial ropeways on spoil or waste heaps known in Belgium as terrils. Underground, women excavated and backfilled as seams of coal were worked, dug out new galleries and shafts, erected timbering and props, and installed walkways and ladders. But the single most important task women traditionally carried out was pushing and pulling the wagons which were used to move coal around in the mines. Readers of Émile Zola's Germinal, published in 1885 but set in a mining town in northern France in the 1860s, will remember that drawing coal wagons is the work done by his character Catherine in that novel. As male miners cut the coal, the women would shovel it into wagons, breaking it up as necessary as they did so, and would then push and pull the full wagons through the galleries to the shafts, where they would be raised to the surface. This pushing and pulling of coal wagons was the task with which the women who worked in the Belgian mines were most associated in the public mind, and the women mine workers, whether they worked above or below ground, and whatever their particular tasks, were given the same generic name of Hiercheuse, which means one who draws a wagon. The writer Oscar Guillain, who was from a mining town near Mons, wrote of the significance of the Hiercheuse in an essay published in the journal Wallonia in 1905. Attention has lately been drawn to this type, at one time extremely popular in our Pays Noir, of the woman collier, or, a better name, the Hiercheuse, the name by which art has succeeded in immortalizing her, a word taken from the old occupation of these young women, which was to pull the trucks along the rough tracks of the mine. She will soon be remembered only among our working populations, this rough Hiercheuse, depicted in her pride and boldness by Constantin Meunier in several of his works, and by so many other artists, Borain and Liégeois, who have powerfully contributed to the fixing of the type in her picturesque or tragic attitudes. The time is near when one will see no more these women who labour in the depths. Guillin's words exemplify the process through which, just as the numbers of women working underground were declining, the cultural significance of the Hiercheuse began to grow. From the late 19th century to the early 20th, the female mine worker, in her distinctive clothing, became increasingly prominent as an image of Belgian industry, immortalized in art, literature, and material culture. For the Liège International Exposition of 1905, a Hiercheuse was prominently displayed on exhibition posters, presented both as a healthy and attractive young woman and as a distinctively Belgian industrial icon, representing tradition, yet not in conflict with notions of modernity. The presence of the Hiercheuse also served to advertise one specific attraction on offer to visitors at the exposition, a working coal mine. This was in the Vieux-Liège part of the exposition grounds. It was described as an absolutely exact reproduction of an active mine. Visitors could see all the operations of a coal mine, including, of course, the work of the Hiercheuse. They could view all the above-ground operations, and, by descending in a cage, were able to visit the coalface, where they could watch miners at work before relaxing with a drink at the underground bar. The theme of the Hiercheuse was taken up by many notable Belgian artists, such as Constantin Meunier, already well known for his depictions of industrial scenes and the working classes. His paintings and sculptures of female mine workers became celebrated regional and national icons, and other well-established and successful Belgian artists, such as Armand Rassenfoss and Paul Maréchal, also took up the Hiercheuse as a subject. These depictions by male artists tended to idealize and eroticize the Hiercheuse, or at least romanticize her, But in this film, we are going to look at a work by a woman artist who showed the female mine worker and the life she led with brutal honesty. Cécile Douard was a French artist who spent most of her life in Belgium and whose art reflected mainly Belgian themes and subjects. She was born Cécile Lycéenne in Rouen in 1866 to a theatrical family. Her mother, Eugénie Herland, was an actress and musician, and her father, Amédée Lycéenne, was an actor and theatrical manager. The family moved to Belgium in 1870 when Cécile's father became director of a theatre in Bruges. Her parents' marriage broke up shortly afterwards, and her mother moved to Mons to set up home with Édouard Cerf, actor-manager of a local theatre, and Cécile grew up using his stage name, Douard, as her surname. Cécile Douard received an excellent and, for the time, notably advanced education in progressive schools for girls in Brussels and Mons, run by two of Belgium's most prominent and influential feminists and educationalists, Isabelle Gatti de Guermond and Marie Popelin. She had already shown notable artistic talent as a child, and at age 14 she decided definitively that she would become a painter. She studied painting in Brussels with one of the leading Belgian artists of the day, Jean-François Portail, who recommended her to the painter and sculptor Antoine Bollard, who was director of the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Mons. Bollard was deeply impressed with Douard and accepted her as a student, although he taught her privately, as the Academy at Mons would not admit women students until 1911. After completing her studies, Cécile Douard acquired a studio and was able to establish herself successfully in Mons as a painter. She painted portraits and scenes of local life and took women and girls as art students. However, in March 1891, she had a fall and suffered a serious head injury which affected her sight. She received treatment, but by the end of 1891 she was effectively blind in her right eye. She resumed her career, and many of her most notable works are from the period 1892 to 99, when she was working with only one functioning eye. During 1898, the sight in her left eye began to decline, and in January 1899, despite undergoing an operation in Brussels, she lost her sight entirely. Cécile Douard was a remarkable woman, courageous and possessed of great strength of character, and did not allow her blindness to crush her. Instead, she embarked upon what she called her second life, as a musician, a sculptor, a teacher, and a tireless advocate for better support for the blind, particularly through the improvement and wider use of the Braille alphabet. She was president of the Belgian Braille League from 1926 to 1937. She died in 1941. The city which Douard made her home for almost all her life, Mons, was sometimes called the gateway to the Borinage, although socially and culturally it considered itself to be quite distinct from the working-class mining country around it. But around Mons the landscape was filled with coal mines and poverty-afflicted mining villages. Foreign visitors noted how, a short distance from the city, the roads became black from coal dust and swarmed with miners going to and from the pits. This map was compiled in 1877 by the chief mining engineer for the Mons region. These are the active mines, and this circle, marking a radius of 2 kilometers from the center of Mons, shows how near to the town the mines came. Although Mons liked to keep the mines at a distance, metaphorically if not physically, the mining districts and the people who lived and worked there attracted much artistic interest, and Cécile Douard was one of the artists who was inspired by this region. As a successful artist in Mons in the 1890s, Douard painted the respectable world of the provincial bourgeoisie, but she also developed a strong interest in the mines and in the people, especially the women who worked in them. She soon developed a parallel career, drawing and painting mining subjects, and her treatment of them was quite different to that of her male contemporaries. Douard did not stay in her studio, but went out to the mining villages and into the pits to draw and paint what she saw. She walked among the pit heads and the terrils, and went into the mines and descended the shafts to observe and sketch the Hiercheuse at their work. Although she did use professional models, her preference, even when in her own studio, was for the authenticity which came from having real mine workers pose for her. Some posed for her regularly, and thanks to the researches of Dr. Wendy Weerts of the University of Huddersfield, who has studied Douard's surviving papers, we know the names of some of them: Sylvie, Zélia, Virginie. To return for a moment to the work of Constantin Meunier, none of his many depictions of the Hiercheuse shows them at their work in the mine. This contrasts with his depictions of male working-class figures, such as miners, labourers, and ironworkers, who are shown strenuously engaged in their various occupations. His female mine workers are shown only on the surface, at the pit heads or going to and from the mines, and they are shown as young and as clean, their standard mine uniform of white jacket and breeches, and their hands and faces largely unmarked by the hard work they carried out, or the dirty environment in which they spent their lives. This was also a time of social upheaval in the Belgian coal mining districts, with strikes, riots, and violent repression of the workers by the state, but Meunier's depictions of the miners give no hint of this. He was himself of humble origins, and his attitude to the men and women of the mining districts and the other working people he depicted in his art was sympathetic and admiring, but always idealized and sanitized. This is part of the explanation for the popularity of his paintings and his sculptures. He did not alienate the sensibilities of the bourgeois elite who commissioned and purchased his work. He could sell them the nobility of labor, and, in the case of his female mine workers, a particular model of youth and beauty, but his patrons and public were not interested in the filth, degradation, poverty, exhaustion, and oppression of working-class reality. The same tendencies can be seen in the work of Armand Rassenfoss, whose Hiercheuse, even when shown in the workplace, are invariably youthful, and are depicted in repose or in static postures inspired by classical sculpture, or looking provocatively at the viewer, who is presumed to be, like the artist, male. Many of Rassenfoss's depictions of the Hiercheuse show them partially naked or with clothes disarranged, reflecting the widespread middle-class perception of female mine workers as women of low sexual morality and uninhibited sexual appetite. Dr. Weerts writes of Meunier and Rassenfoss as follows: wanting to please a clientele that consisted mainly of bourgeois men, Meunier mostly depicted young, gracious, slender, and charming women. In his paintings he often removed any trace of the old, ugly, or deformed women who worked in the mines. Armand Rassenfoss went even further, not merely beautifying his female subjects, but turning them into temptresses. Douard, to the contrary, did not conceal the painful nature of the women's work. Cécile Douard's approach to the women of the mines is indeed very different. This is Cécile Douard's painting La Hiercheuse, sometimes titled La Hiercheuse en repose, painted in 1896. It shows a female mine worker seated on one of the huge mounds of colliery waste that marked every mining district. She is sitting directly on the ground, with her legs drawn up in front of her and her hands around her knees. Her right foot is placed so that it overlies her left. Her posture is a strange mixture of strength and vulnerability. Her clothes, unlike the neat uniforms that enhance the graceful forms of Meunier's idealized Hiercheuse, has an air of shapeless decay and is dirty and ragged. Layers of tied rags provide some protection for her feet from the harsh surface of the ground. Her neck and head emerge starkly from her upper garments. Her hair is almost entirely covered by a headscarf, with just a few wisps of golden hair escaping round the edges. It is hard to tell her age, but there is nothing youthful or girlish about her. She might be in her 30s, perhaps working below ground until she had a child, or was injured, or unable for some reason to endure any longer the conditions in the depths of the mine, and moved to above-ground work among the terrils. This was a common pattern of working life for the women of the mines. Her face is strong, with high cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and a firm set of mouth and chin, but is marked by years of toil, and is slack with exhaustion. Her mouth is slightly open. Her eyes are in shadow, and do not meet the eyes of the viewer. Her gaze is set on nothing. The overall coloration of the picture is dark, dominated by greys and browns, with occasional streaks of grubby white and dirty red, and the whole scene seems choked with dust. Shapes of waste heaps emerge dimly in the background, while in the foreground the humped form of the woman seems to blend with the desolate landscape behind her. Lying next to her is a lamp, not a miner's safety lamp, but a cheap tin lantern which keeps her candle shielded from the wind. Also beside her is a wooden-handled trowel. These accessories, the nature of her clothing and her location, establish the nature of her work at the mine. She is one of the women known as glaneuses, gleaners, or ramescales, scavengers, who scour the waste heaps in search of fragments of usable coal mixed in with the mining debris. They would take the coal they collected for their own use and for sale in the villages. The trowel is for digging out the coal from the waste, while the lantern lights the way across the treacherous surface of the terrils. Although the name Hiercheuse was used to refer to all female mine workers, it was, by the 1890s, so firmly associated with the idealized female figures of Meunier and Rassenfoss that it seems a deliberate challenge to that perception for Cécile Douard to adopt the term for her depictions of the women those artists ignored, who wore rags instead of neat uniforms and struggled to survive by scavenging among the waste tips. She did produce more conventional representations of the Hiercheuse, but her main preoccupation was clearly with grittier depictions of the more marginal female figures of the mines. In this picture of her studio, painted in 1889, a large framed study of such a figure can be seen on the wall. The posture of the woman is very similar to that in the 1896 painting, even down to the feet placed one upon the other. But this woman has her head in her hands, and seems to be staring fixedly straight ahead, creating an even stronger feeling of despair. This powerful representation in charcoal from 1894 shows a gleaner in one of the Borinage mining villages. In this case, the woman is holding the trowel with which she digs out the coal she collects. Two more gleaners are at work on the slope of the heap behind her, bent low over the ground as they search for fragments of coal. This work was often carried out on hands and knees. On the left, a gleaner can be seen taking away the coal she has collected in a sack carried on her back. The upper edge is folded across her forehead to make the heavy sack easier to carry. Douard also depicted women carrying sacks down from the terril in her painting Le Glaneuse du Charbon of 1891. In this work, two women and a young girl carry sacks of coal which they have gathered on the waste heap, their bodies bent almost double with weariness and with the weight of the sacks. Their clothes are dirty and ragged, and the young girl on the right is walking with bare feet on a surface made up of sharp-edged stones, dust, and fragments of mineral waste. The woman in the foreground carries a tin lantern of the same kind which Douard shows in her painting of the Hiercheuse seated on the terril. The desolation of the landscape and of the lives that are led among the pits and the waste are powerfully conveyed. The palette is a subdued mixture of browns and greys, while the sunset, which has brought these women's long working day to a close, fills the sky with glowering yellow and red. In Les Terrils, one of Douard's last paintings, completed in 1898, she shows the side of a waste heap crowded with desperate, ragged figures scrabbling for coal as colliery waste cascades down around them from the wagons that are being emptied at the summit. Douard's paintings of mine workers that consist of single figures or small groups have a deep humanity, but here, as she pulls back to show a multitude of small figures swarming across this desolate, man-made mountain, as the filthy waste products of the mine are literally dumped on their heads, she seems to show us creatures who have had the humanity crushed out of them. Despite the very different viewpoints, in both cases she shows a scene of human degradation, even of horror, and demands that we do not look away. Placing Les Terrils side by side with La Hiercheuse reveals a pattern of contrasts and similarities. In each case, the canvas is dominated by a single form. In Les Terrils, the heap of colliery waste. In La Hiercheuse, the seated woman, whose form echoes the shapes of the heaps behind her. The gleams of light and blue sky that are visible behind the Hiercheuse of 1896, like those above the Terrils in the Glaneuse of 1891, seem to offer little hope. The woman has her back to the light, and for the figures on the waste heap, the light in the sky is unreachably remote. It seems there is no access to the light for the toilers on the ground, and of course there is a double irony here, for these pictures were painted as Cécile Douard's sight was failing, and for her, too, the light would soon be lost.